She brought him breakfast every morning for 3 years, until the day a convoy of military vehicles pulled up to her house, and she realized the old man she'd been feeding wasn't who she thought he was. Myra stood on her crumbling front porch, barefoot and trembling, watching as uniformed officers stepped out of those dark vehicles, their boots striking the gravel in perfect unison. The neighbors emerged from their homes one by one, drawn by the spectacle, their whispers building into a low hum that filled the morning air. She clutched the empty basket, the same wicker basket she'd carried to Mr. Calloway's cottage every single day since she was 14 years old. Her mind raced backward through every conversation, every smile, every time he'd thanked her with that gentle nod, and those eyes that seemed to carry an ocean of untold stories. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening. 3 years earlier, Myra had been walking home from school when she'd spotted the old man sitting on his porch, staring at nothing. His cottage sat at the end of Maple Street, half hidden by overgrown vines and surrounded by a chain-link fence that leaned inward like it was too tired to stand straight. Most people ignored him. Some whispered that he was strange, that he never went anywhere, that his lawn was an embarrassment to the neighborhood. But Myra had seen something else. The way his hands shook when he tried to open his mailbox, the way his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller disappear. The next morning she'd knocked on his door with a plate of toast and scrambled eggs her grandmother had made. He'd opened the door slowly, cautiously, his face lined with suspicion and something deeper, fear maybe, or disbelief. "What do you want?" he'd asked, his voice rough from disuse. "I thought you might be hungry," she'd said simply. He'd stared at her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes searching her face for mockery or pity. When he found neither, something in him softened. He'd taken the plate with hands that trembled slightly and nodded once. "Thank you," he'd whispered. She came back the next day, and the next, and the next. At first, he barely spoke. He'd take the food, nod, and close the door. But gradually, over weeks and months, he began to linger. He'd ask about her day. She'd ask about his garden, the small patch of tomatoes he was trying to coax back to life. He never talked about his past, never mentioned family or friends or what he'd done before he'd ended up alone in that cottage. Myra never pushed. She sensed that some doors were meant to stay closed until the person inside was ready to open them. Her grandmother had warned her once, "Be careful, child, you don't know anything about that man." But Myra had looked into Mr. Calloway's eyes and seen only loneliness, the kind that hollows you out from the inside. "I know enough," she'd said. By the time she turned 17, their routine was sacred. She'd arrive at 7:30 every morning, even on weekends, even when she was exhausted from late-night studying or working her part-time job at the grocery store. He'd be waiting on the porch, his posture a little straighter than it used to be, his eyes a little brighter. They'd talk about small things, the weather, a book she was reading, the mockingbird that had built a nest in his gutter. Once he'd told her she reminded him of someone he used to know, but he didn't say who. His voice had cracked when he'd said it, and she'd pretended not to notice the wetness in his eyes. She thought she'd never see him again. She was wrong. 3 days before the military arrived, Mr. Calloway hadn't answered his door. Myra had knocked and called his name, her heart hammering with sudden panic. She'd peered through the window and seen him collapsed on the floor, his face ashen, one hand clutched to his chest. She'd screamed for help, and a neighbor had called an ambulance. The paramedics had taken him away, and she'd stood in his empty yard, the breakfast growing cold in her hands, wondering if he'd ever come home. Now, watching those officers approach, she felt the world tilt sideways. The lead officer was a woman with silver hair pulled back tight, her uniform crisp and decorated with ribbons Myra didn't understand. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her expression unreadable. "Are you Myra Johnson?" the officer asked. Myra's throat felt like sandpaper. "Yes. I'm Colonel Hayes, may we come inside?" The house suddenly felt too small with all of them standing in the living room. 5 officers, Myra and her grandmother, who'd emerged from the kitchen with flour still dusting her hands. The colonel's gaze swept the modest space, taking in the worn furniture, the photographs on the wall, the crocheted blankets folded over the couch. "You've been visiting James Calloway," the colonel said. It wasn't a question. "Every day for 3 years, Myra said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Is he okay? The hospital wouldn't tell me anything." The colonel's expression shifted, something like respect flickering across her features. "He's stable. But there's something you need to know about Mr. Calloway." She paused, and the silence stretched so thin it felt like it might snap. "His name isn't James Calloway, it's Colonel James Calloway, retired. He served 32 years in the United States Army, including 4 tours in combat zones. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Cross." The words hit Myra like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. "After his wife died 10 years ago," the colonel continued, "he disappeared. He withdrew his pension, changed his name through legal channels, and cut contact with everyone who knew him. We've been searching for him for years. Why? Myra's grandmother asked, her voice sharp with protective concern. Because he saved 73 lives during his last deployment, another officer said, a younger man with a crew cut and eyes that looked too old for his face. My father was one of them. Half the people in my unit owe their lives to Colonel Calloway. The colonel reached into her jacket and pulled out a photograph. She handed it to Myra. It showed a younger Mr. Calloway in full military dress, standing with a group of soldiers, his face strong and proud, nothing like the hunched, quiet man she'd known. But the eyes were the same, those pale blue eyes that had seen too much. He suffers from severe PTSD, the colonel said softly. After his wife passed, he couldn't handle being around people anymore. He isolated himself completely. She looked directly at Myra, and something in her gaze made Myra's chest tighten. Until you're the only person he's allowed into his life in a decade. The hospital called us because they found his military ID in his wallet. When we went through his home to find next of kin, we found something else. She nodded to another officer who stepped forward holding a small wooden box. He opened it carefully, reverently. Inside were hundreds of drawings, sketches on napkins, notebook paper, the backs of envelopes. Every single one was of Myra. Myra smiling, Myra talking, Myra holding her basket. He told the doctors, the colonel said, her voice thick with emotion, that you were the reason he wanted to live. The room blurred. Myra felt her grandmother's hand on her shoulder, grounding her. He's awake now, the colonel continued. And he's asking for you. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Mr. Calloway, Colonel Calloway, lay propped against pillows, looking smaller than she remembered but more present somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. When he saw her, his face crumpled and tears slid down his weathered cheeks. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have told you. Myra crossed the room and took his hand. Why didn't you? Because I was ashamed, he said, his voice breaking. After everything I'd done, all the medals, all the respect, I couldn't even take care of myself. I couldn't face the world. And then this 17-year-old girl showed up at my door with breakfast and I thought. He stopped, struggling for words. I thought if you knew who I'd been, you'd expect me to still be that person. And I wasn't, I'm not. You're exactly who you need to be, Myra said firmly. You're my friend. His grip tightened on her hand. You saved my life. No, she said, you saved your own. I just brought breakfast. Outside the hospital window, the world continued turning. Cars passed. People walked by. Life moved forward, indifferent and relentless. But in that room, something fundamental had shifted. Two people separated by decades and experience, but connected by daily acts of simple kindness, had found their way back from the edges of different kinds of darkness. The colonel had told Myra that dozens of veterans wanted to visit, to thank the man who'd saved them or their loved ones. Slowly, carefully, they would help rebuild the bridges he'd burned. But it would be at his pace, with Myra there to steady him. Because kindness doesn't vanish, it waits, and it finds its way back.